actually also in Braamfontein as we continue to track all angles of the story for you this morning. And Ayanda, we've had so many worthwhile guests in studio over the past week of protests from Wits University students. You know, one of those guests, I remember telling you that as government grapples with another increase in our unemployment rate, it's in our interests, isn't it, so that more students can go and get an education so that our country can start to rebuild, especially given COVID-19.
You're absolutely right, Michelle, and that is actually at the heart of the type of fervor, if you like, that we've seen from students themselves and many other people who actually back what they do when they take to the streets calling for free education. If you weren't following the news cycle in South Africa and were to make your way to the streets of Johannesburg today, you'd be none the wiser about the ways through which the traffic that you might be seeing taking place behind me has been disrupted. But of course, if the developments over the past few days are anything to go by, the sense of normalcy, if you like, that's taking place here might be short-lived. Of course, Michelle, what also took place in Johannesburg yesterday was a night vigil in memory of Mthokozizi Ntumba, who we now know is a 35-year-old man who sadly passed on after being shot by police during the scuffles in some parts that took place between protesters and some authorities there. Really a heart-moving and heart-wrenching moment as students bid farewell to a man that many actually didn't know before the protests themselves took place. But at the heart of what's actually being contested here, Michelle, as you rightly point out, are futures. And that's why we're expecting today to also, in some respects, resemble the kind of, call it, strong force of action, if you like, to take place on the streets of Johannesburg. Yeah,
absolutely. Mthokozizi Ntumba, a father of three, a man whose youngest child is a year old, also someone who, ironically, killed in these fees protests, had just achieved his master's degree. So given what Bladen Zamande had to say yesterday, that money will now be found for the 2021 academic year, surely, and Zikona Chona has alluded to that as well, surely what students want to know today is what happens beyond 2021? What happens to other outstanding issues, including historical debt?
Yeah, and it's in that way, Michelle, that I think the announcement from the Higher Education Minister certainly did not go far enough. Issues of historical debt, also, Michelle, largely remaining unresolved, at least insofar as I'm concerned. And what has always been communicated from the beginning, dating all the way back to 2015 even actually, has been students calling for free education in unequivocal terms, and not necessarily a bursary that's been converted into a loan, not necessarily giving some kind of payment scheme. So I imagine that is the backdrop upon which many people will still take to the streets today, despite that announcement that I guess government was hoping will be able to quell some of the fury that we saw spill out into the streets. Now, we've heard from the Human Rights Commission in some respects too, also weighing in, given what many people consider to be, real human rights violations. And in just a moment, we'll get your insight from their standpoint now that we're here. But it really does almost come across as a Shakespearean tragedy, doesn't it, Michelle? A man who's just attained some kind of qualification in higher education, sadly losing his life in a fight where people are also trying to get access so that they too can, I guess, secure their future in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, we've been talking about what the Human Rights Commission had to say, not only about these protests. I know Buang Jones has now joined you there in Braamfontein while he gets ready to join you on air. Shall we talk about some of the other outstanding issues that many experts have come onto our show to talk about, including how police have responded to students who have been protesting on the streets of Johannesburg, including, the use of excessive force. What qualifies as excessive force? Are there guidelines for how rubber bullets can be used by police? And to many of these questions, the answers are quite vague.
Absolutely. And in fact, it is in that way that I think the police have also come under real sharp scrutiny, especially in ways through which they've dealt with crowds, generally speaking, even in our recent history. It's not only about student movements. I mean, we can take you back to Senegal, moments that we've reflected upon taking place in Brackenfell. There appears to be an inconsistency in how police respond to the demographics that are involved in these protests. But B, issues that you also touch on, moments where their use force have been questioned at best, have raised eyebrows at the very least. And I imagine that is the kind of issue that many people will want to reflect upon once the proverbial dust settles, so to speak. And it's in that way also that I imagine, Michelle, that a lot of anger will be sustained today, days after the unrest actually began, at least insofar as this wave of protest is concerned. But experts coming onto platforms like the AM Report, being at pains to explain that police should resolve to the type of violence we've seen over the past couple of days as a matter of last resort, and only in instances where there's a clear threat to life. The Human Rights Commission has also come out and also voiced similar concerns around what appears to be just an unnecessary response, Michelle, to the protesters themselves. Buang Jones, as you mentioned, has just arrived. And I wonder if I'm able to just call Buang to just give us his reflections, given where we are and where it is that we'll move in a couple of months of the Human Rights Commission. Absolutely. As a Chapter 9 institution, given not only what we've seen, but what's also likely to unfold. Buang, you're live on Newzroom 405. Thanks very much for being with us this morning. I want to, as we look back at the week gone by, just to get your reflections, given what was meant to be the start of the academic calendar in tertiary institutions, but what unleashed a dramatic series of events which sadly also cost us a life.
Yeah, it has been quite a traumatic start to the new academic year. It is disappointing that we are still dealing with the same issues, and the violent suppression of protests is something that concerns us as the South African Human Rights Commission. We would like the authorities to deal with the contents of demands and the legitimate issues that have been raised by the students. As South Africa, we have a proud history of protests. And the manner in which the police have dealt with protests is something that concerns us, because they are meant to facilitate the exercise of the right to protest, not to suppress it. But the tendency has often been to suppress it. The approach is often heavy-handed, violent, and unnecessary.
Buang, the frustration and fury has been launched in all directions. The Human Rights Commission as an institution has also come under fire in some quarters for not seemingly doing enough to have a repeat, as you rightly admit, of the kinds of suppression that we're seeing in the country. Perhaps it's worth outlining what the human rights is mandated to do in these instances, not only to solve the immediate problems, but to also resolve a recurrence of these issues.
Well, we are required to promote, to protect, and to monitor the observance of human rights. And in relation to the right to protest, the Commission has a number of ways in which it could deal with instances such as this. It could facilitate engagements between the state and protesters. We can also provide training, which we have already done for members of SAPS and the JMPD and other metropolis departments in Gauteng, to assist them to understand how to observe human rights during protest, how to deal with protests. But we also have a responsibility to amplify awareness amongst communities and protesters, to understand that no protests are not illegal. It's a constitutional right which is guaranteed in the Constitution, which should also be exercised responsibly.
All right, Buang Jones, thanks very much. We're going to have to leave it there, at least for now. No doubt we'll be getting the reflections of the Human Rights Commission as we enter into the morning for the day ahead. The Human Rights Commission, in the form of Buang Jones, they're stating that there has been training, and part of their mandate is to increase awareness. The question now becomes, Michelle, is that enough?
Absolutely, and that's a question that can be asked of many of our institutions as the story continues to unfold. My co-anchor, Ayanda Nyathi, live to us there from the streets of Braamfontein as we continue to cover from all angles yet another day of these student funding protests.